if you have a deeply held belief that you will never be well, or if you have a deeply held belief that you deserve to suffer, or whatever it may be, this can absolutely be a barrier and block you from being well. And I discovered I had lead toxicity because I saw in my genetic report that my body did not detoxify lead well. And I'd already done a hair test for heavy metals, wasn't significant amounts of lead. I'd done a urine test for heavy metals, there wasn't a significant amount of lead. So,
Hmm.
in that case, most practitioners, right, they wouldn't think, well, let me also do a blood test. They would just assume, there's
Right.
not a heavy metal problem. But I did a blood test and it was sky high. So that kind of indicates that what my genetics was saying was 100% true. My body had a problem with detoxifying it specifically. It wasn't excreting it. That was really the
Hey, health
problem.
junkies. On this episode of the Health Fix podcast, I'm interviewing Elwin Robinson. If that name sounds familiar, that's correct. He was on before. And in this podcast, we're actually going to be talking about his Rejuvenate Blueprint, where he talks about the 7 root causes of all chronic disease. And I have to agree with him that he's got it pretty nailed down in terms of what I've described before when I've gone through why people have chronic illness. Now, the cool part about this podcast, we're going to go into placebo. We're going to talk about how toxins can manipulate your DNA. We're going to talk about the connection between nickel and H. pylori. And we're going to talk about how low calcium diets can contribute to lead poisoning and lead toxicity. Crazy, right? Well, here's the thing. There are so many things right now that could be contributing to our chronic illness or mystery illness that really understanding your DNA and then pairing it with a micronutrient test to understand what's happening in real time is a game changer. So Elwin is the founder of Genetic Insights. He has all kinds of information on his website based on DNA testing, and you can take your DNA testing from other companies and then plug it in there. Such cool stuff. If you loved geeking out on DNA, Elwin was on my podcast, episode 493. If you did not catch it, go check it out. You can get that anywhere you get the Health Fix podcast or on my website if you just search under podcast episode 493. Now, Elwin has a ton of information. I'm also on his podcast. If you go to his YouTube website at Elwin Robinson, just YouTube and then search Elwin Robinson, you'll find him there. I love DNA. I love geeking out on all the intricacies of our bodies and why everyone has their own unique twist to health. And so when you're listening to this podcast, I want you to think about how unique we are and why these cookie cutter programs aren't working for folks. It's because we need precision medicine, and especially when it's boiling down to chronic and mystery illness. All right, let's reintroduce you to Elwin Robinson. Welcome to the Health Fix Podcast, where health junkies get their weekly fix of tips, tools, and techniques to have limitless energy, sharp minds, and fit physiques for life. Elwin Robinson, welcome back to the Health Fix Podcast.
Thank you. It's really great to be back. And thank you for coming on my podcast too recently. That was really good.
Yeah, we had a great time talking about amino acids to the point where I was like, there's like 5 more I didn't tell you about that I work on with, but we'll get
It's
there.
always the way.
We'll get there someday. We'll get there someday. Well, one of the big things that, we had talked about in our previous podcast was DNA and how, you're working with helping folks interpret their DNA at Genetic Insights. And in this case, I was taken back by how detailed you are about looking at the root causes of chronic disease and how much you understand like the geeky stuff like me getting into the amino acids and getting into vitamins, minerals, and details. And so I wanted you to come back because I really wanted to talk about the 7 root causes of all chronic disease as you see it and your Rejuvenate Blueprint so that we can really give folks a sense of there are things they can do step by step to start looking at these things. And this is probably a very controversial statement, but I feel like a lot of people want to do things on their own and sleuth it out a little bit on their own with a little bit of guidance, but aren't at the level where they want the very expensive functional medicine doc. So this is kind of the in-between place to start. And so anyway, this is where I'm like helping folks give the tools, right, to start opening up their options for their health. So
Yes.
here we are. here we are. And with the Rejuvenate Blueprint, I mean, I think we'll get to that, of course, folks, as to where you can find it on Elwin's website and how to get a hold of these things. But first and foremost, let's talk a little bit about DNA as a root cause of chronic disease. How did that play out in terms of, folks, if you listen to our previous podcast, you'll hear the story, but if we can do like a recap for them in a short version of how that played out for you and why you got so excited about DNA.
Yeah, I mean, the very short version is I had a health problem. It, created agonizing pain, made me lose a lot of weight, a lot of other symptoms, lose a lot of weight in a bad way. I was kind of looking emaciated and I was feeling cold all the time and full of anxiety and digestive problems and chronic pain and all that kind of stuff. And I tried everything. That's the simple version. And I really mean, it's never everything, is it? But I tried a lot. I listed it in the last episode, and including functional medicine doctor, several. And no one was able to help. And then I got my genetics tested. In fact, I'd already had them tested. I'd done a 23andMe like 8 years before. And I uploaded that data to this system that was able to interpret that data. And I was blown away at how accurate it was and how helpful it was. And it really did help me to work out the root causes of what was going on with me. So it indirectly led to me getting a diagnosis from a doctor, which is always helpful. But more importantly, I think, was it actually led to the root causes. And the one good thing I could say about those years and years of struggle of not being able to find anything, and I wasn't new to health. I'd been, teaching about health since 2010. And I'd kind of been into it my whole life because my parents were into it. And, my dad was a biochemist, and there was supplements and organic food throughout the house. And my dad did organic gardening, and, so all that kind of stuff is all part of my family, I guess, for my whole life. But especially those few years, like 4 or 5 years of suffering with that issue, and really being in a fortunate position in a way of not having to work. So I dedicated myself to full-time detecting what was going on. And realizing that, okay, there really are, and I'm so glad you invited me on to talk about this, Dr. Jannine, and I'd love to get your feedback on it as well. But as far as I can see, there really are only 7 root causes of chronic disease that exist. Now, this is in the scientific sphere. I know, some people will talk about other stuff, like, I don't know, energies, for instance, which I am open to, but I kind of limit myself to that, which can be definitely proven, even if it doesn't have to be mainstream. And so for me, genetics was the first step. And in fact, working with a lot of people, I really like to start with genetics. And I often will send them on to someone else, whether it's a medical doctor, a functional medicine doctor, or a therapist, or whatever it may be. It could be a lot of different things, a nutritionist, a dietitian, a physiotherapist, whatever. But I like to start with the genetics because that's really the blueprint. And so, because these are the things that you can't change about yourself. Now, we talked about this last time, but just as a recap, you cannot change this genetic blueprint that you've been given from the moment of birth, which is related to what we call SNPs, which is little mutations, little differences in your basic genetic code. But of course, you can change your health because the SNPs only indicate certainly all the ones that we look at only indicate a tendency, not a certainty. Sometimes the contribution that genetics make is very high, like 70 or 80% is down to genetics. Sometimes it's very low, like 5 or 10%. That's usually like the range that we work within. And maybe on average, it's about 40%. So for instance, with heart disease, the number 1 or number 2 killer throughout most of the world, around 40% of your risk for that, cardiovascular disease, actually, let's broaden it beyond heart disease, is genetic, and so if you have that risk, if you have that tendency, that's very important to know that. And it's also very important to know why. What is it about you? Is it that you have a high risk for insulin resistance, or is it that you have a higher risk for stress, or is it that you have a higher risk for these certain types of plaque building up in your artery walls, et cetera, et cetera. Like, it helps you to narrow down what that is as well. So that's why whenever I work with people, I do want to look at their genetics first. And I encourage many practitioners when I talk to them like yourself to also remember not to skip that step. Now, I know you have some questions about genetics, but I think it will make more sense if I talk about the other 6, because there are genetic factors related to the other 6 as well. And I just want to say on the subject of root causes, like I'm so happy that it is in the conversation now to even look at the root causes of chronic diseases. And when I say conversation, I mean like the mainstream conversation. I'm seeing it on like mainstream news channels in the last few weeks. It's like no one's ever talked about this before. And I think it's, in the mainstream. And I think it is fantastic that it's part of the conversation. The most of the conversation I see is like, why has the rate of chronic diseases ballooned so much, especially in the last 4 decades, since like the 1980s? And I think that is an excellent question. And generally, the theory I see posited is that a lot of it is down to poisons or toxins in the environment. And I think there is a lot of accuracy to that. And I think it is definitely worth investigating. I'm very glad that some people do want to investigate it, who maybe actually have the power to change things. So all of that is fantastic. But I do think that it's not only that. It's not only toxins, right? And so, a lot of people ask me, for instance, with weight loss, that's a very popular topic, and in terms of genetics, and they say, if I'm overweight or if I want to lose weight or whatever, is it in my genes that I'm overweight? And I say, well, yes and no. So no, in the sense that 100 years ago, people on average were consuming just as much or more calories than us, including plenty of sugar and plenty of saturated fat, and yet obesity was less than a tenth of what it is now. So obviously it can't be just genetics because our genes have not mutated so significantly in the last 100 years. However, it is true that not everyone becomes obese, no matter how poisoned they are or whatever other factors are going on. Some people develop very different problems. And so whether it develops for you as obesity or as an autoimmune disease or as a tendency towards chronic infections or as, whatever of the myriad other problems it could be, that's more where genetics comes in. So genetics does not guarantee you'll have any disease or any problem or any issue, but it says, if you start to develop diseases, problems, or issues, which ones are you more likely to develop first? For one person, it's one thing. For one person, it's something completely different. And so that can be very, very helpful information. Let me go through the other 6 steps. I'll try and do it as quickly as possible. So the first step that I look at after having a basic look at genetics is nutrition. And so I often refer to that as building blocks rather than nutrition, because I'm basically looking at what are you made out of, right? We're made out of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, blanking on the fourth one, sorry, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and the other one, anyway. You're also struggling.
I'm blank.
And then
nitrogen.
Thank you. Nitrogen, of course, protein. Thank you. And then a bunch of other ones to a lesser degree. Yeah. Iron and calcium and magnesium and all this other stuff. Right. And so a problem which including that, if we go a little bit beyond elements, would be like vitamins and amino acids, which you and I did a whole episode out of. And it's actually surprising. I am surprised. And at the end of our podcast, Dr. Jannine, you might have seen, I appended at the end a testimonial video that someone volunteered to do who was one of my clients, because their life was transformed after 40 years of anxiety, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to cure it. Nothing worked. And then all they did is start taking an amino acid, and it was like, I think they said 85% better within a few weeks. Now, that result's not typical, and that's certainly not guaranteed for anyone else. But the point is to say, if you're lacking a certain building block, it could be as simple as a vitamin, a mineral, amino acid, a type of fat, or something else, sometimes a coenzyme, something like that. If you're really lacking that building block, getting you the building blocks that you need can have an absolutely huge transformative effect on your health. And it absolutely can be a root cause. It's not commonly a root cause, maybe, that it will reverse a chronic disease, like it used to be, like 100 years ago, where people had goiters and beriberi and scurvy and all these kind of things, maybe 150 years ago. But it's still, that's kind of debatable, and it's still contentious as to how much, when people have all these serious issues. I've seen people cured of all kinds of things that are considered serious medical issues with just vitamin B12, just iron, just magnesium, just vitamin K2, just amino acids like glycine. I know you've had, similar experiences. So it can be as simple as a building block. And so that's often, I focus on that first. And how do I know what they need? Well, I look at their genetics first. And then if it's something that is innocuous and harmless to take, like vitamin B12, I say just go for it. And if it's something that you don't necessarily want to take because you might have, you don't want to overdose on it, like iron, then I recommend that they test and see and make sure to check to see if they actually need it. And so that absolutely can be a root cause of chronic disease, and it's often a contributor, and it often works with the others. We've already mentioned toxicity. So toxicity is like number 3 on my list. And certain toxins will deplete certain nutrients, right? At sometimes a radically elevated rate. So addressing the toxin may be kind of more root cause in that case, but you still also have to address the deficiency of the building block. Otherwise, the person still won't get better, right? Because it is still another root cause. It is something that has to be addressed. So toxins are obviously huge. There's many, many, many types. The thing that I discovered for me, without again going to the whole story, is that I had very, elevated lead toxicity. It was over 10 times what should be the maximum, reference range for an adult. And when I first tested it, and that's the kind of thing that can. People's response to different heavy metals vary, but it can absolutely ruin your health, and it did to me. And there's heavy metals, mycotoxins. A lot of people talk about that in the community. And then there are things that perhaps we don't think of as even being a problem, which can become a problem. Like I mentioned mainstream news talking about chronic diseases for the first time. I saw a thing about seed oils and how damaging they are, especially in excess. When 100 years ago, I think our diet was less than 1% seed oils, and now it's over 30%. And it's not to say that they are innately bad. Probably 1% of the diet is probably fine. But in excess, a lot of things become toxins. I just mentioned I started with heavy metals and mycotoxins. I think they're some of the only things that are innately toxic at any dose. Yeah. I'm sure there are other things as well, but they're kind of commonly known. But there are many, many other things that are only toxic in excess, but so many of us have an excess of them that they become super important. Like xenoestrogens and stuff like that being another thing in that category that's really big. And there's loads of other things, atrazine and PCBs, and the list goes on and on. We could do a full episode on that, but that's a root cause, right? And it's a root cause in the sense of if you don't address it, you will never be optimized. That's a definite, and you will probably never be well if you don't address those root cause, if it's already got to the point where it's caused a disease in you. The next one after that, and it's kind of 4th on my list, but it's sometimes what I start on with people because of how quickly it makes them feel better, and feeling better is, very important, and it gives you the energy and the motivation to do all the other stuff sometimes. And it's hormones, neurotransmitters, and peptides, and the balance of those. And this is where I would refer back to genetics again. I kind of skipped this for toxins. So let me do it for toxins just for a second. So I discovered I had lead toxicity because I saw in my genetic report that my body did not detoxify lead well, and I'd already done a hair test for heavy metals. Wasn't significant amounts of lead. I done a urine test for heavy metals. There wasn't a significant amount of lead. So, in that case, most practitioners, right, they wouldn't think, well, let me also do a blood test. They would just assume, there's not a heavy metal problem. But I did a blood test and it was sky high. So that kind of indicates that what my genetics was saying was 100% true. My body had a problem with detoxifying it specifically. It wasn't excreting it. That was really the problem. And so, we have reports for that. We have reports for the different heavy metals, mycotoxins. We have reports as well about other things that your body might have an issue with, like histamine and salicylates and oxalates and all of that kind of stuff. Things in foods that your body might treat as a poison. And I suppose in the toxin category, just before I move on, I'd also put in allergies and intolerances. Even if something is not at all innately toxic, if your body perceives it as a toxin, then it kind of has a similar effect as a toxin. And again, that can be a root cause. Now, there's still the question of why is your immune system reacting to things that are perfectly innocuous as if they're poisons? and there is a root cause to that in turn. But still, if it's doing that, you've got to cut that stuff out at least temporarily in order to be well, in my experience. And so I'd still put it in that root cause category. So back to hormones and neurotransmitters. So again, I'll give myself an example. For me, I saw that I had a genetic tendency for elevated cortisol and a genetic tendency for reduced thyroid hormones. And so when that's the case, you're someone, energetic tendency for low levels of DHT, which maybe is a little bit too. But basically, all those things indicate is a tendency towards low levels of cellular energy and a tendency to elevated stress, and also a lack of ability to really calm yourself, like the opposite of stress, like the GABA agonists. Mm-hmm. And so when a person is in chronic stress, I don't think this is going to be a revelation to any of your listeners. It's impossible to be healthy and to heal when a person is in consistently high levels of stress, right? Short-term stress, few hours, maybe a couple of days at most, can be healing, can be beneficial in certain contexts. But once it's weeks, months, years, decades, it's definitely not going to be good for you. And so again, I like to start with that often. And again, I wouldn't take any action based on only the genetics, but it helps to narrow down what to test for, especially when people have low money. Our genetic testing is so affordable compared to any other kind of testing. The amount of information versus dollar is ridiculously large amount of information. And so it can help you narrow down. Like, for instance, tell me if I told this story last time, but I have a business partner who really isn't into any of this kind of stuff. He's all business, doesn't want to go to a doctor, got a typical man in that sense. Doesn't want to do anything about his health, but he was really struggling. He's like, I can't even get out of bed for like an hour. And this is very unusual for him. Suddenly, not a person lacking motivation. He's like, maybe I'm depressed. And I'm telling this story, by the way, he told it on his podcast, so I'm allowed to say it. And I was like, yeah, could be. But, I listened to stuff and I said, you know what? You want to be part of this genetic insights business, you've got to actually do the genetic insights test. I was like, what's involved? I said, you just got to spit into a tube. He's like, all right, then he's willing to do that. So he did that, got his results back, and sure enough, he was in high risk category for hypothyroidism. And sometimes we can give an actual percentage risk score. We don't always do that, but sometimes we can. And that one we do, and he was like 99th percentile. So I was like, okay, this is like evidence that my, suspicion, again, not proven, but there's enough evidence now to make it worth you going to the effort of going to the doctor, paying for that, paying for the blood tests, which he then did. And sure enough, it came back that he had hypothyroidism and he had Hashimoto's, which, as you know, if that's not addressed, it's only going to get worse and worse, and it's a real problem. And so, that's an example of someone who's very reluctant. But even if you're listening to this, I'm not reluctant. Okay. But if you were to test for, let's say you have something as diffuse as like fatigue, the amount of things that you could test for that might be the cause could run you what? Over $10,000, right? So easily, yeah. Yeah, maybe over $100,000. So to just help to narrow it down, right? Okay, so it could be the thyroid, it could be this heavy metal, it could be this, and then okay, let's start with testing these things. The most obvious things that it could be is like really, really helpful. And so, as I said, I like to start with hormones and neurotransmitters, because if someone has a tendency for low dopamine, or if they have a tendency for low thyroid function, or if they have a tendency for whatever, then that's like super, super important to address if we're looking to help people feel better. Now, feeling better, that brings me to the next one, which is lifestyle changes. And a lot of people don't like that I make this number 5, because that's the easiest thing you can do. That's the first thing you should be doing, right? But you and I both know, in practicalities, making changes to the lifestyle is quite difficult for a lot of people. Yeah. So the one benefit about lifestyle changes is that it's free. So if you're poor, that's great. It probably should be the first step in that case. But for everyone else, with a job or whatever, the problem is making lifestyle changes. You've got to overcome the inertia. You've got to overcome the neuronal pathways that make behaving in a certain way kind of feel right and behaving in any unusual, different way feel wrong. And you've got to overcome any practical considerations. Someone tells you the first thing in the morning you go out and get sunlight. Okay, what if you live on the 40th floor of an apartment building? Like all of that kind of stuff you've got to deal with. And you've got to also accept reality. So I'll give you an example. Everyone agrees that exercise is beneficial, pretty much, right? They may argue about what type and this and that, but pretty much everyone agrees that not being stationary is beneficial. And, I often talk to people, especially trainers, who are like, oh God, this person, they won't even do this and they're so lazy. And I'm like, they're not lazy. I don't believe it's laziness. I think if you saw someone and you were like, oh, they just don't want to eat, they're too lazy to eat. Like, you wouldn't do that. And to me, moving is as intrinsic as eating. And if someone doesn't want to eat, we would say there must be something wrong with them. Maybe, they're severely depressed, they've got a digestive problem. Maybe people like you and me would go, well, how's their ghrelin levels or their leptin,
Right.
all that kind of stuff.
Right.
But there's something wrong, right? We wouldn't say you're too lazy to eat. And yet movement is something that if you have any degree of innate health and vitality, you enjoy doing, you want to do it. You don't have to make yourself do it. You don't need discipline. You don't need willpower. And yet we call people lazy if they don't exercise, if they don't move, which makes no sense to me. So with a lot of the lifestyle stuff, fresh air is good for you. Okay, but what if you live in a city? Sunlight is good for you. Okay, but is it always, right? You and I know that some people are photosensitive. There's certain specific situations where sunlight actually makes people feel worse for various reasons. So there's nothing pretty much in the lifestyle category. Meditation is universally considered to be good for you, if it, at least a little bit, but then, for people who have high levels of cortisol and low levels of GABA, it's torturous to try and sit there for 10 minutes and quiet your mind. Like, it just makes you feel worse and worse and worse. So there's none of that lifestyle advice that is going to be universally beneficial and easy to implement for people. And though that's why I put the other stuff I just said first, including balancing the hormones and the neurotransmitters, because once that's done, it's a lot easier to then make those lifestyle changes, which are extremely important and beneficial, obviously.
Makes sense.
Next after that, I have infections, specifically chronic infections. I would say acute infections are more in the category of, requiring emergency medical treatment. That's not to do with chronic disease. Like, acute infections can cause chronic diseases, but, like, they can have caused one, but, they don't need treating if they were acute, because you either resolve them or you're dead. So if we're talking about years later, right? So we're really talking more about chronic. And so with chronic infections, the reason I put it in this place, now, again, this kind of goes a bit against the functional medicine doctors think, right? Because functional medicine doctors like to deal with that first, especially in the context of the gut. If it works, it works. Look, if you can get a person and just give them berberine or rifaximin or, whatever, probiotics, and they feel better, then, great, that's good. But I think a lot of the time it doesn't work out that way, right? It's actually quite difficult and quite tricky. And so one of the things that I learned years ago is that a few years ago, I wish I'd learned it before, I did, is you have to get the adrenals and the thyroid in a reasonable place. First of all, before you do a lot of detoxification, and second of all, before you try and tackle chronic infections. Otherwise, you may be able to get rid of them, but they will just come back again, And so that's why I like to put it, sixth. I could have put it fifth, but I don't want to push lifestyle too far down the line. And also, as we know, I think a lot of the time, chronic infections are actually based on, so they're not based on hormonal issues. The other thing they're often based on is toxicity, There's a excessive presence of toxicity that is probably undermining the immune system to the degree that it's not able to handle things in a lot of cases. And there's specific types of toxins that will massively increase your chance of having specific types of infections, like nickel, for instance. Not many people talk about that one, but nickel and H. pylori, which leads to stomach ulcers and all the rest of it. And if you could do a treatment for H. pylori and it may be effective, and it may be effective for years, but if you've still got that nickel toxicity, it'll probably come back sooner or later when you're weak and tired and stressed and worn down or whatever, right? So it's like that's why I put dealing with those toxicities as primary. And with all these things, including the chronic infections, we have genetic reports on, some of the most popular ones, common ones, I should say, as to, whether you have an increased risk for them. Some people do have an increased risk for different infections. And then the last one, and again, people who really believe in this last one don't like that I put it last, because they're like, this should be first, though, and this is the most important. And it's, I call this emotions or psychology. And that's because if you have a deeply held belief that you will never be well, or if you have a deeply held belief that you deserve to suffer, or whatever it may be, this can absolutely be a barrier and block you from being well. And there is this thing called the placebo effect. I've seen some mainstream medical people try and undermine that recently. I don't know if you've seen that, Dr. Jannine, but my reply to this is always, but wait a minute. You guys say that all the supplements and everything we recommend are pseudoscience because they are not backed by double-blind, placebo-controlled trials. So that means that it's essential to do double-blind trials in order to prove the effectiveness of something. Why do we have to do double-blind trials? We have to do them because of the incredible power of the placebo effect, right? You can't have it both ways. So the placebo effect in a nutshell is, if I truly believe, not just if I tell myself, but if I truly believe that something is going to heal me, then it will, at least for a while, temporarily. From my own research on the placebo effect, it kind of has a shelf life, like a few months in some cases. Like it doesn't always last forever. But certainly for a while, it can completely reverse even terminal diseases and all kinds of stuff if you really, really believe it. But there is also something called the nocebo effect, which is the exact opposite, which is if you truly believe that something will not work, then it won't, even though it should. And, there's all kinds of stories about this. I think Dr. Joe Dispenza did a good one on this, just on I think he did a whole book just on the placebo effect called You Are the Placebo. Mm-hmm. And the concept of that, and it's not a new concept, but I think the way he described it in quite a scientific way was fairly unusual, is that, that you can maybe take control of, you can kind of placebo yourself, which is very difficult because the whole point of the placebo effect is you've got to really believe it. And so it's very hard to kind of convince yourself of something that is not true, but it's potentially possible. And that's kind of what his system is based on. You can kind of convince yourself you're healthy, and for some people it works. But the point is that your beliefs and your feelings are very powerful. And I'm also a big fan of, mentioned Dr. Joe Dispenza, I'm a big fan of Alexander Lowen, who created a system called bioenergetics. And I think he lived to 90 something. He was certainly pretty healthy. And he, just book after book after book, he just goes through talking about his personal experience and they're all anecdotes, but just the correlation between someone's emotions, their traumas, their kind of habitual emotional fixations, the shape of their body. That's what's interesting. It's not all psychological. He'd literally say, their chest is kind of, caved in, or their shoulders are raised, or their kind of glutes are tucked in, or they've got a twist here, or all of this kind of stuff. And to me, this makes perfect sense. So in order to not feel feelings, what we actually have to do is we have to hold like a certain posture in our body. And so if you're angry, a lot of people, clenching their fists, clenching their jaw. If you're afraid, a lot of people kind of like hiding to some degree, right, with their body. If you're sad, a lot of people try and, stop themselves crying, and you got to stiffen your kind of lungs to do that. And so a lot of people kind of learned to not show feelings. Maybe that was necessary because to show the feeling would have made whatever happened worse. But then it becomes like a habitual response. And so there's this chronic patterns of tension in the musculature and the fascia and all the other elements of the body. And when it makes sense to me scientifically, first of all, the placebo effect is scientific, as we've just established. Mm-hmm. Second of all, scientifically, it made sense. If you have chronic patterns of tension in a certain area of your body, it will reduce the blood flow going in and out of that area, and it will reduce the lymph flow going in and out of that area. You don't have to believe in chi or any of that other stuff. These are just the scientific facts. And so if you have a lack of blood flow and lymph flow for a day, you may well not notice. But what happens if it goes on for weeks, months, years, and in fact decades? It can lead to serious problems. If there's a lack of blood flow, it can lead to, for instance, buildup of acidity, which can cause, pain, as one example, right? But the lack of blood flow long term can mean that, for instance, if it's lack of blood flow to an endocrine gland, like to your thyroid gland, or to your thymus, or to your pancreas, or whatever it might be, then it's not going to function as well over time and all the rest of it, right? So I think there's two obvious ways there that our emotions, our belief systems, our psychology, profoundly impact our health. And as I say, people who believe in that often believe that that's all they have to focus on. Like, all I've got to do is visualize or meditate or affirm or, whatever they're into, and I can heal myself. And sometimes they're right. Sometimes that is all it takes. The reason I put it as number 7, Dr. Jannine, is not because I don't believe it, but because I think if you're trying to use purely the power of your mind or your will or your belief or whatever you want to call it to heal a very physical problem, it is still possible, but it's difficult, which is why a lot of those people, do it for a long time before it works, or they do it a long time and they give up. So it's better to also address the physical problems. Second of all, while it says changing your lifestyle habits is quite difficult, a lot of people have a lot of resistance doing that. Well, changing your habits of how you think and feel and what you believe is very difficult. Right. And a lot of people, that's kind of their last resort. It's certainly, if you say, I've got a headache, or I've got a, whatever diagnosis, if I were to say, oh, well, the first thing you need to do is, meditate on feeling well 2 hours a day, a lot of people are not going to be open to that as a strategy. So it tends to be more a last resort, although I would encourage people to, consider it before the last resort, which is why I make it part of my system. But yeah, so that's it in a nutshell, Dr. Jannine. That's the 7 factors that I believe. That's why I call my book Rejuvenate Blueprint, resolve the 7 root causes of all chronic disease. And I'm happy to be told if you think I'm missing anything. That's one of the reasons why I'm doing a little bit of a tour as well. And please, I'll make it 8 causes if I'm wrong. But I believe that's it.
I think you got it pretty well nailed down. I do, because really, absolutely agree with you on putting the mental side of things last, because it is hard when someone comes in, they don't feel good. The last thing they want to hear is we're going to meditate. No, it's let's figure out what's going on. And then we can get to that state. Because, yeah, I believe in it. It's incredibly helpful, part of the whole picture. But, of course, being the geek that I am, I'm going to dive in and feel figure out what's going on. Because at the same time, I will say with the psychological aspect of things, it's if you don't know what you're dealing with, it's very hard to focus your mind somewhere if you don't know what the problem is.
Also true. Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great point.
Yeah. So that's why I kind of go into that too. But no, I think all 7 are solid points. I don't, a lot of folks would say, what about the gut? Where would you put the gut? Because a lot of people will prioritize just the gut, right?
Well, what about the gut?
Right.
If it's, if the root gut problem is a chronic infection, then that's in number 6, right? If it's lack of peristalsis, or what's causing that? If it's, lack of stomach acid or bile flow, or what's causing that, right? It's ultimately down to the same thing. Is it nutritional deficiency? Is it a toxin? Is it chronic infection? That's what I mean about root causes. And you could say I'm just being arbitrary, you could break it. But what's the root cause of a nutritional deficiency? Well, sometimes it's something else, but sometimes it's just because you haven't had the nutrient, right? Either you haven't had it in your diet, or you have an increased need because of genetics, or you have increased use for whatever reason, right? They say of magnesium, if you have a lot of stress, if you have a lot of activity, even if it's positive stress, you're going to use up more magnesium. So then, so sometimes I guess it could be a little bit circular as to what isn't a root cause. But what I found is that each of those 7, they can be the root cause, and then other times they're merely contributing factors, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I once created a video, a YouTube video of me talking with the screen behind me of all the different spots and how they're all connected in. Because, I mean, I think just to help people to understand, because we talk a lot about gut health and things of that nature, but If you're not absorbing, you're not digesting, there's an infection. All part of this picture here. You're kind of going at more the minutia, the more, detailed things versus systems. So it
Yeah,
makes sense to me. And chemicals, toxins. I'm glad we're getting some press. Yeah, I'm glad we're getting some press there because I
definitely.
feel like, for a lot of time, and you probably felt like this too. It's just like we just keep saying it. We just keep saying like, hello, hello, wake up, hello. Something going on here, people. Especially since the 80s.
Definitely.
You look back at the data. So absolutely.
However, I do agree. However, I will say in the alternative health community, so more our community, I think there might be an excessive focus on detox. I quite often have people
Yeah.
going in, they've done so many different cleanses, fasting, supplements, herbs, all kinds of things. And I'm like, okay, but like you're obviously like completely adrenally overcharged. I mean, that's really, really common. In fact, fasting and stuff makes that worse, not better. Or
Right.
like you're really, nutritionally deficient, which again, fasting makes that worse, not better. And so I do think, I think more for the average mainstream person who would not know what we're talking about at all in most of this conversation, like toxicity is probably maybe like close to number one most important factor. But ironically, I think a lot of people in our community, it's not necessarily like they often jump to assuming that it is the most important factor. It's the same thing, like there's such a what's the word? There's so much disappointment that when you go to a mainstream doctor, they usually have no input on diet. And if you say, could this disease be caused by diet, they will always say no. So that like people like, it just feels intuitively wrong. And so in the what I call mainstream alternative health world, which is generally the most popular kind of health gurus, experts, whatever you want to call them, they often put out super best-selling books that are all like, this diet will fix everything, and it's so like compelling to people because they just heard the opposite, like diet makes no impact. They're like, that can't be true. And then they're like, diet makes all the impact. All you got to do is eat this diet and everything will go away. And it's like a really compelling message. And obviously sometimes it's true, because it's true if you clean up the diet and eat the right one for you, you may resolve your nutritional deficiency. So that's one of my root causes. You may resolve the toxicity issues. So that's another one of my root causes. You may even resolve a chronic infection, so it's, I can see why sometimes it's true that like this diet will cure everything. But of course, many times it's not. And then I feel like sometimes there's people that act in very ethical ways, like, or maybe not them, but like their followers or people moderating their groups or whatever. And they'll say to you, it's not the diets because you're not doing it right. I've been part of those communities, like a raw vegan community. Oh, you've only been 99% raw vegan. That's why you're still ill. You got to be 100%, or see the same thing in the carnivore community. Well, what, you're still having honey, or you're still having potatoes? Well, that's why, right? You're going to be 100% carnivore. So, and I think all that stuff is, really unfortunate and unhelpful. It's like a reaction to the mainstream thing. And so I think what people like you and I do is super, super important. It probably, I hope I'm wrong, but it might never be as popular because it's not as simplistic, but it is actually the truth, right? Which is, there's often multifaceted causes and everyone's different. And it's so important to find out what it is for you. And so, I so respect people who do what you do. And because unfortunately, there's even a lot of practitioners out there, if you go to them, and they'll just try and fit you into their system, right?
Right.
And then like everyone basically gets the same advice or slightly different versions of the same advice. And it's so unhelpful. It's such a shame.
That is a problem. I do agree with you that that's a problem in the industry because yes, everyone's got their proprietary I'm not knocking your blueprint because this is a real blueprint versus a proprietary method. Let's go that way because of
Sure.
how they've got a lot of success with this one way of doing things and they got to keep everyone does that one way. And this is very rampant in the hormone space in particular. And it's like, ooh, there are so many genetic components to hormones and why one person tolerates them, the other one doesn't, or the whole process. And so I'm kind of cringing because mainstream now we've uncovered that all the myths of the myths of bioidentical hormones not causing cancer, but we're also still giving pharmaceutical medications that have toxins in them that we don't know if someone can even break down, one, the toxins, two, how they metabolize or methylate or translate, like any of the details of the hormones. And so it's, it's one of those things. I do get on a soapbox, so I'm going to jump myself off of this one here. But yeah, the proprietary method, I'm not into it. I'm into precision, and detailed per person type of treatment. And that's, I won't do a cookie cutter, everybody gets the same thing, because not everybody's the same, as we know.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And it's much harder to do it that way. That is the truth.
It is. It's hard to create a business model when you don't have your, this is my method, and this is a way to do it.
That's what I'm trying. I'm calling it a blueprint, and I've also got a book forthcoming called a diet. But the one of the first things in there is like, there is literally no food that's right for everyone. So it's like, it's not. But I'm using the name diet, but then I'm teaching people how to actually work out what's right for them. That's kind of the idea.
Well, we have to do the marketing, right? We have to do the marketing one way or the other. And so folks, now the whole thing is sell them what they want, give them what they need. And ultimately, I admit fully, like I'm giving you what you need, and we're going to figure out what you need. I'm not going to give you it. We're going to figure it out is more how it is. But it makes sense. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the big questions that I was getting from my audience, Owen, about the genetics is, how does the membership work, and what happens, and how can they glean information from the membership? So you were saying you might be able to show us a little bit. So those of you who are listening, we're gonna try to help you visualize what's going on. This is why we want folks to look at video. Go over to YouTube, or you can go to Rumble, and you can see what we're showing here, because Elwin's gonna give us a run through of what you can get from the membership when you work with Genetic Insights there. So he is getting over there right now for us, so you can see.
This is basically what you get. These are my results. I'm totally happy to share them. And so the default, you can see a little thing here that says sort by risk, Dr. Jannine. So that's kind of put as a default on, but what it does mean is when you first look at it, you're like, oh my God, I got all these high risk things. So you can also turn that off, and then it's just kind of presented in alphabetical order. But so I have all access membership, which is where you have access to everything. It's over 500 reports. I think it might even be 600 now. It's a lot. So it's a lot of information. So what I recommend to people is to really look at it through the categories. I think the categories are really crucial. Now, what would I start with? It really depends on what the person's interested in, obviously, heart health or whatever. But let's say that someone comes to me, they have no issues whatsoever. They're just purely interested in optimization. Then I might go through it in kind of the order that we just talked about, So the first one I might look at is this one. It might take a second to load. It's pretty quick today. Nutrient needs, right? And so we can see with myself here that there are certain nutrients which I have an increased need for. And so, calcium is an interesting one, because that's one that's been much maligned in, I'd say, our kind of sphere for a while. Like, calcium supplements are not good. Magnesium is what you really need, all of this kind of stuff. Yeah. But some people do need more calcium. This is true. Now, I don't actually take calcium. I take calcium glucarate, which I guess contains calcium, but I don't take specific calcium supplements. But what I realized is I was having, I think the recommended daily amount for calcium is like 1,000 milligrams a day for men. I realized for years, because I wasn't eating dairy or anything else really high in it, I was having 200 milligrams a day. And funnily enough, a low calcium diet is a risk factor for lead toxicity, because the less calcium you have in the diet, the more lead your body absorbs. So this is something super helpful for me to know and to, address, because it's not very easy to test for calcium levels, as we know, like a NutrEval or whatever is not going to tell you that, right? Lysine is one that we've talked about, Dr. Jannine. Last time, I think that I have increased need for lysine. I confirmed that in a NutrEval test, and it said that I'd increased need. And I think I mentioned last time, it took me 2 years of high protein diet and additional lysine supplementation before it was finally showed as being sufficient. I think 2.5 years, actually. It took up, anyway, a very, very long time. And I was having a lot. I think I was having 5 grams a day of lysine on its own. And it still, took that long. And actually, I still take it, because I'm like, well, obviously need more of it than the average person. So that's like really helpful information to know. So, vitamin E, vitamin K, very important. That's a very, it's essential anti-aging nutrient, I would say, vitamin K, because of its role in stopping tissue calcification. Low levels of isoleucine, again, that one was confirmed by Nutrival. And I'd always been underweight my whole life. I think I discussed that last time, kind of low muscle mass. And when I reversed that one did kind of get reversed quite quickly. It was the first time I started to put on muscle. I'm still not big and muscular, but I went from being underweight to normal, and I think the isoleucine was a part of that, because if you're low on any of the branched chain amino acids, you can have an issue with that. Now, it's not always accurate. So in this case, high oxalate sensitivity. To be honest, I don't actually eat anything that oxalates, but it's not for this reason. Like, I've tested this on Nutrival, doesn't seem to be any issues with oxalate. So just because you have a high risk of something doesn't necessarily mean that you have it. It's just a risk, right? So that's always important to bear in mind. It's always good to do further testing. You don't have to do lab testing for oxalate sensitivity. You can just try removing it from your diet for a few weeks. If you feel better, great. If it makes absolutely no difference, then never mind. You can carry on having oxalates after all. Now, I include stuff in there that, may not be obvious. Like, I include sleep quality. I think I have stress in there as well, because I think these are like essential factors when it comes to detoxification. So, for instance, if someone really has issues with sleeping, that can be a root cause. That's, number 5, lifestyle causes. That can be a root cause as to why a person has problems with toxicity. If they're only sleeping 4 to 5 hours a night, everything else being equal, they could still have an excess toxicity problem, even if they don't have any genes that mean they have an issue of toxins. It's just they're not sleeping enough, Either hormones or emotional well-being. I rarely get requests for emotional well-being when I have clients, but I often look at it anyway, because I think if I can help a person feel better, to the step 7 thing, then that can make a huge difference to their quality of life, and they definitely won't feel bad that they've come to see me. So yeah, you can see what I'm talking about there. Tendency for high levels of cortisol. I know that everyone these days kind of has high cortisol to some degree compared to maybe what they should do, or a lot of people. But I only see this in about 10% of people. It's not super common to have it actually in your genetics. But if you do have it, it obviously has an impact, as everything does. Tendency for low levels of T3, like I talked about. Tendency for low levels of DHT, like I talked about. So again, all super helpful information. None of them necessarily things that you would take action on without doing further testing, as we've discussed. Now, I'm showing you the all access, which is $197 at most with your coupon code. I think it's HealthFix or the HealthFix. You have to check that. Yep. 25% off, so $150 for all of this information. Now, for people who only are interested in one area, like right now I'm on emotional well-being, those, you can just get one of these categories. And honestly, most people don't. It's a lot cheaper. And in a way, it can be beneficial, because otherwise it's so much information, which this is way simpler than most systems out there. I hope you'll agree, in terms of being user-friendly for the average person rather than being practitioner-focused. But it's still just a lot of information. So it's actually, if you're only interested in blood sugar, or if you're mainly interested in anti-aging, or if you're mainly interested in weight loss, or whatever it might be, sometimes it is a good idea just to get one of those and just focus on that. Or if you want to get them all just because it's better value or whatever, be disciplined with yourself and just kind of focus on one category at a time, maybe. And like, okay, first of all, I'm just going to get my nutrients dialed in, and then I'm just going to look at detox, or I'm just going to look at weight loss, or whatever it might be. So yeah, I have a high tendency for obsessive compulsive tendencies. This is fairly new, but not surprising. I remember this, especially as a kid. I would be like, couldn't step between the cracks in the pavement and kind of stuff like that. So I never had it like full blown, I don't think, but this tendency towards it, yeah, absolutely. And that's why it's, near the top there when we talk about sort by risk. The membership site, every single one you download and you get a full report with, dozens of pages of information, including a lot more scientific research, a bunch of citations, and a load of recommendations.
Nice. Such good stuff here. I'm glad you shared it. It's good for folks to have a little insight in here and be able to kind of just see like, okay, this is what you're getting and this is how to attack it too. Just using your blueprint to be able to think it through if they're not dealing with anything major. Because if they are dealing with anything major, I'd go to that first.
Yes. Yeah. Just focus on that category. Like weight loss is quite a popular one. And you'll see, I mean, we have a weight loss report and we have a tendency to regain weight again quickly report and kind of obvious stuff like that, metabolism. But you can see in there, leptin, which I guess relates to hunger. But you can see there's other stuff in there, that tendency to overeat. I guess that's obvious. But you can see there's other stuff in there that people wouldn't think of. Like I put psychological trauma in there because we know that that's one of the reasons why people, have an issue of losing weight. Or I put in stress, or I put in oxytocin or insulin resistance, estradiol, metabolic syndrome, underactive thyroid, like all of these things can be the root cause as to why you struggle to lose weight or why you gain weight easily or whatever, And so that's why I think other people, they might only have like the weight report, but we have dozens in there. Because it could be carbohydrates, right? If you respond poorly to carbohydrates, that's something you need to know. If you respond poorly to saturated fat, that's something you need to know. If you have a tendency for low, hypoglycemia, that's something you need to know. So yeah, just another example of how it really gives all the clues for root causes that it can do.
Makes sense. Okay, Elwin, well, we got to tell everybody where they can find the Rejuvenate Blueprint. And we can where they can find all the genetic insights, information, and all of those details.
Thank you. If you go to rejuvenateblueprint.com and also my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Elwin Robinson, just my name. I have several videos there on the Rejuvenate Blueprint, several videos where I do more of a walkthrough of the genetics if you want to have more of a look. And I kind of have topic-based videos. So if you want to lose weight, if you want more energy, if you have blood sugar imbalances, any of that stuff, I've probably got a video guide on how to help yourself with it. Obviously, my preference is that you go and see a practitioner like Jannine. I usually say it in the video, but I also want to help you to find what kind of practitioner, is actually going to help you. So I often give that kind of advice in those episodes as well. And lastly, geneticinsights.co, so not .com, but geneticinsights.co. You can get 25% off by using the coupon, the HealthFix. Thank you so much for having me on again.
Hey, my pleasure, Elwin. It's always a good time. I've no doubt that we'll probably have some more to geek out on here soon. Hey, fellow health junkie. Thanks for listening to the HealthFix podcast. If you enjoyed tuning in, please help support me to get the word out about the podcast. Subscribe, rate, and review, and just get that word out. Thanks again for listening.